All right, so let's look at this polynomial. We have a coefficient in front of 1 in front of our x squared. So we're thinking what multiplies 1 times 21. So multiplies to a 21 and we'll add to 10x. Okay, because the key thing to remember is that with our brackets at the end, our last term multiplies to 21, our first terms multiply to x squared, and then our middle terms add to 10x. So to get 21, we multiply 1 and 21, and those will add to 22. We can also multiply 3 and 7, and those will add to 10. So we know that our middle term is going to break into 3x and 7x. So when we break that middle term up, we can now look for GCF between our first two terms and our last two terms. So between x squared and 3x, we can take out a GCF of x, and we're left with x plus 3. And between 7x and 21, we can take out a GCF of 7, and we're left with x plus 3. We can now see that our brackets are the same. So we take out our GCF of x plus 3, and we're left with x plus 7. Okay, so now we're going to factor x squared minus 8x plus 12. So again, we're thinking what multiplies from the 1 times 12, so times 12, but now we need to add to a negative 8. So remember from your hints, this tells us that they're the same sign, so they're both going to be negative. So in order to multiply to 12, we can do 1 and 12, we can do 2 and 6, or we can do 3 and 4. So since they're both going to be negatives, we're then going to add them and see what we get. So remember, we want to get the one that will add to a negative 8. So when we add these, the first combination we get a negative 13. The second combination we get a negative 8. And the third combination we get a negative 7. So that tells us that our middle combination of negative 2 and 6 is what we're going to break down the negative 8 to. So when we do that, you can see that we've broken negative 8x into negative 2x and negative 6x. We then want to remember factor by grouping. So we're looking at the first two terms and factoring those. So we're thinking, okay, what's a GCF between x squared and negative 2x? So when we do that, we can see that we can take out the x, and we're left with x minus 2 from factoring x from each of these first two terms. Then, when we look at the last two terms, you want to look for a GCF again between negative 6x and positive 12. So we know it's a 6, but the key thing is that you remember you want your first term to be positive. So if we only factor out a 6x, we'd be left with negative x, and then we'd have plus 12. So the key thing is, by taking out the negative 6x, we're going to have a positive x as our first term, and then positive 12 divided by negative 6 changes it to negative 2. So now both of your brackets are the same, and we have those as common to be factored out. So we have x minus 2 as our common bracket, and then what was in front was our x minus 6. All right, so let's look at this polynomial. So remember, we're thinking what multiplies first times last. So we're thinking what multiplies to a negative 24, but it has to add to a positive 5. So again, we want to use our hints. So our hints are our last term is a negative, so that means that they're going to be different signs. And then the middle sign being positive tells us that the biggest factor will get the positive sign. And so the biggest gets the positive, and the negative at the end means that one's a plus, one's a minus. So thinking of our factors of negative 24, we can have 1, and 24. We can have 2 and 12. We can have 3 and 8. And we can have 4 and 6. And then we can see that, all right, 5 doesn't multiply to 24, and then we get to 6, so we start repeating our pattern. So if we want it to be a negative 24, 1 has to be negative, and remember our biggest will get the positive from the middle, so all our smaller factors get the negative sign. So when we add them, we get a positive 23, we get a positive 10, we get a positive 5, and we get a positive 2. So the factors that we want to use are negative 3 and a positive 8. So remember, you're going to break your 5x into a negative 3x and a positive 8x. So when we do that, we're then going to pair and take out a GCF. So when you look at this, remember you're looking at x squared and negative 3x. What's the GCF? We have a negative x, and we're left with x minus 3. From 8x and negative 24, we have a GCF of 8, and we're left with x minus 3. So remember, our common brackets are x minus 3, and then our x plus 8 is what's left over. And now it's completely factored. 1 is a plus, 1 is a minus, and the order of your brackets does not matter. Okay, so we're going to do one final factoring. So the key thing here is that we have a first term that's no longer 1. So we have to multiply 3 times 16. That tells us that we're going to multiply the factors of 48. And they're going to add, because of our plus sign at the end, they're both the same sign. So they're going to add to our middle sign. All right, so they're both positives, so multiplies to 48 and adds to 14. So multiplying to 48, we have 1 and 48. We have 2 and 24. We have 3 and 16. We have 4 and 12. We have 5 not going into it, 6 and 8. 7 doesn't go into it, and now we're back at 8. So remember, both the same sign, both positive, so we don't need to worry about our signs. We just need to look at our sums. So 1 and 48 add to 49, 2 and 24 add to 26, 3 and 16 add to 19, 4 and 12 add to 16, and 6 and 8 add to 14. So remember, if you're able to go straight to, you know it's the 6 and the 8, then you can go ahead and split up your 14x into 6x and 8x. The order doesn't matter. You could do 8x plus 6x, but seeing that it starts with a 3, we might want to put the 6 first, just because we know that there's a GCF between the two. So we've broken it up, looking for your GCF between 3x squared and 6x. Remember, you can take out a 3 from both of the coefficients and an x. Looking at the last two terms, you can only take out an 8 from 8 and 16. But when you take out your GCFs, you can see that 3x and x become our first term, 3x squared, and our 8 and our 2 multiply to give us our last term, 16. So 3x and 8 will be our second bracket, with our x plus 2 being common. All right. Okay, so let's look at some special factors. So here we have multiplying 1 times 36, so multiplying to 36, but it has to add to a negative 12. So we know that from our hints, they're both going to be the same sign. And we look at our little sign, and it tells us that they're both going to be negatives. So if we think about that, we want to also look for any special symbols or hints to us. We look at 36, that's a perfect square. If we multiply to get 36, we can think of all our different factors, 1 and 36, 2 and 18, 3 and 12, 4 and 9. But when we get to 6 and 6, we know that it adds to 12. And then if we both are negative with all of our different factors, we get a negative 12. So that's our combination that you want to use. So when you break up your middle term from 12x to negative 6x and 6x, we can look for GCFs of x from the first two terms and from the last two terms a negative 6x. Remember, you want to take out the negative because you want your first term in the second bracket to be a positive. So again, we take out the negative so that we have a positive a positive x, and then we get minus 6 from negative 6 times negative 6 will give us the positive 36. So now we have the common brackets. So we can see that both of our brackets are the same, so we can write it as x minus 6 squared. So this was a perfect square that was expanded because we ended up with a perfect square at the end, and our middle term was double the square root. So if we take the negative 6 and we double it, we get our middle term of negative 12. And the last scenario that we have is the difference of squares. So you always want to look and check if you have a difference of squares. And the way that you do that is you look for your hints. We have only two terms and they're separated with a negative sign. If you have two terms and they have a plus sign between them, you won't be able to factor unless it's just a GCF. But when you have two terms that are both squares, okay, so 25 is 5 squared, you have a difference of squares because you're subtracting two square numbers. You can still do decomposition because what you're thinking of is you're multiplying first times last, multiplying to a negative 25, but you're adding to 0. So the only way that you can add to 0 is if your middle terms are both the same with different signs. So multiplying to 25 are 5 and a negative 5. So if we break our 0 down into 5x and negative 5x and then look for your GCFs, you'll still be able to find that you have your middle terms. Sorry, there should be an x here. So you have common brackets, and then you have your x minus 5 outside. So your final answer is x plus 5 and x minus 5. So again, difference of squares will have two square numbers that are being subtracted, and your final answer, you could skip to that if you recognize it's a difference of squares, will be the square roots is each term, and one is a plus and one is a minus. Remember, you always need to look for a GCF first out of any of your terms.